Michael B. Jordan was sitting under the harsh lights of a minimalist studio set, the kind built to make interviews feel intimate but staged. His posture easy, but eyes sharp as the host across from him flipped through her notes, trying to match the energy that pulsed from the room, a quiet mix of awe and anticipation from the small audience seated just outside of the frame. He'd been invited on to talk about his latest project, a film with weight and subtlety, but the tone of the interview had quickly turned playful, veering from carefully worded questions about process and craft into the slightly uncomfortable territory of tabloid curiosity, which Michael handled with practiced calm, occasionally flashing that disarming smile that made people forget how smart he really was, how tuned in to every detail of these kinds of public performances he'd become over the years. Until finally, after a pause that lingered just a few seconds too long, the interviewer glanced up from her notes and said with a forced chuckle, "Well, what else can we possibly ask you?" And before the moment could flatten into awkwardness, Michael leaned slightly forward and said, "Why don't we ask the audience?" In that calm, grounded tone that both challenged and included, shifting the weight of the exchange, suddenly making it feel like a shared moment instead of just content being extracted. There was a murmur from the crowd, a ripple of excitement at the idea of getting involved, but something in the host's smile faltered, just for a second, before she regained composure and nodded, signaling to a producer off-camera who looked caught off guard. And though it seemed like a spontaneous suggestion, Michael had clearly done this before, had clearly learned to read the subtle signs of disconnection and redirect the moment before it turned on him, and now the tension was beginning to build. Not in any loud or obvious way, but in the way the host's posture stiffened ever so slightly. The way her next question came out clipped and flat, as though he had challenged her authority on her own stage. And the audience, perhaps sensing the energy shift, began to quiet, their laughter now hesitant, uncertain whether this was still entertainment or something else. Something unscripted beginning to form beneath the surface, and though Michael's expression didn't change, there was a flicker in his eyes. Like he was waiting, like he already knew what was about to happen next. And the camera stayed rolling. The questions had trickled to a stop, the energy in the studio thinned out like smoke in a cold room, and the host glanced at the monitor to her right before turning back to Michael with a sharpness that wasn't there 10 minutes ago, her voice suddenly loud and clear as she said, "Well, that's it then. We're done here. Thank you, Michael. Next celebrity, please." And for a moment Michael just blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right, caught off guard not because the interview had ended, but because of the blunt finality in her tone, the way she didn't wait for a closing note. No wrap-up, no soft fade, just a cold dismissal like he was one segment in a long conveyor belt of faces, and he tilted his head slightly, still seated, his voice low and confused. "Wait, why are you rushing me off like that?" But the host didn't flinch, didn't smile, just leaned slightly forward and said, "You've had your time, Michael. We're moving on. You're not that interesting anymore." And the words hit with the quiet sting of something personal, masked as professional, and a silence spread through the room, a brittle, uncomfortable silence, broken only by the faint buzz of the studio lights above, as the crew and audience sat frozen, unsure if this was still part of the show or if something had fractured in real time. Michael, to his credit, didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out, just stood up slowly, his expression unreadable, jaw tight, but calm, like someone measuring every breath to keep the weight of the moment from slipping into something bigger. And he said, quiet but steady, "You'll regret treating me like this." And the host rolled her eyes, waving toward the side of the stage. "Security's just outside if you don't want to leave on your own." And there it was. The final insult, the public demeaning of someone who had spent years building his name, now being asked to walk away as if he'd done something wrong, when all he did was suggest giving the audience a voice. A gesture meant to include, not overshadow, but that clearly shook the show's fragile ego. Michael paused just before stepping off stage, turned slightly as if to say something more, then stopped himself, nodded once, and walked out without another word, leaving behind a stunned room and a host who now fidgeted with her earpiece, the control she thought she had beginning to flicker under the surface of her rehearsed poise. The camera kept rolling, not because it was supposed to, but because no one had called cut. And for a second it felt like everyone in the room, knew something had just happened that would follow them long after the episode was uploaded and buried under thumbnails. And then, like a shadow slipping just out of frame, there was movement behind the scenes, a producer disappearing into the hallway where Michael had gone, voices rising behind the curtain, not loud but serious, layered with tension, and though no one knew exactly what was being said, it was clear this wasn't over, not by a long shot, because when a man like Michael says he's coming back, you believe him. Not because of fame or pride, but because something inside him just shifted. A threshold crossed, and now the story had only started to turn. And what happens next? Well, you're going to want to see it for yourself. 5 minutes passed like an ache behind the eyes, the studio in a strange, suspended silence where no one dared speak too loudly, the host pretending to scroll through her notes while crew members exchanged awkward glances, and the audience sat in stiff, half-confused postures, unsure whether they were witnessing a production delay or something unraveling in real time. And then, without warning, the backstage curtain parted slightly and Michael B. Jordan reappeared. Not alone, but flanked by the show's executive producer, a tall man in his late 50s with a professional calm that didn't quite hide the tension in his jaw, his presence turning heads instantly, the room shifting with a palpable electricity that said this was no planned segment. And without looking at the host, the producer walked straight to center stage, stopping in front of her with the kind of quiet authority that makes everything else feel less real. And in a voice that didn't rise above normal, but somehow cut through the air like glass, he said, "Thank you, that'll be all. You can step out now." And for a split second, the host smiled in that half-confused way people do when they think they're being joked with. But the smile didn't stick, because the producer didn't blink, didn't budge, and finally she stood, flushed and fuming, trying to regain control with a few muttered protests about miscommunication and production timing. But it didn't matter anymore, because the decision had already been made, and as she stormed off toward the side of the stage, no one stopped her, no one said a word. The silence she left in her wake heavier than anything she'd said during the interview. The producer turned to Michael, nodded once with quiet respect, and motioned for him to sit back down. Not on the same chair, but one moved slightly closer to the camera, as if to reset the frame, recenter the focus, and then, without any cards or teleprompter, he sat across from Michael and began asking questions. Not fluff or filler, but things that mattered. Things that let Michael talk about the real weight of the stories he tells, the pressures of carrying roles that reflect a generation, and the moments when vulnerability off-screen becomes a kind of resistance. The audience leaned in now, more present than before, not because they were told to clap or laugh, but because something raw was happening. A crack in the polished surface of celebrity media where something honest had managed to slip through. And the producer, though he didn't smile much, asked with genuine curiosity, and Michael responded with a cool, measured openness, no grand speeches, no vendettas, just a steady reclaiming of space that had tried to push him out. And by the time the conversation wrapped, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Less like a segment, more like a reckoning, quiet but permanent, and as the cameras slowly faded to black, the producer leaned slightly toward Michael and said just loud enough for the mic to catch, "You'll be back. This is only the start." And something in the way he said it, something grounded and deliberate, hinted that the show wouldn't just replace the host, but rethink everything, from tone to direction to who gets to speak without being cut off mid-sentence. And though Michael didn't respond directly, the faint raise of his eyebrow and the slight nod he gave back said more than words. A silent agreement that the next time he sat in that chair, the conversation wouldn't just be different. It would matter, and anyone watching could feel it now, that slow-burning sense that they'd just seen the beginning of something, the first fracture in a system too long protected by habit, and if you stayed long enough, if you kept watching, something bigger was coming, something worth your time.